Now, the question comes up from time to time, and you might even be wondering yourself, why do I want to use stored procedures? Well, stored procedures in Microsoft SQL Server 2012, just like all versions of Microsoft SQL Server, stored procedures offer many benefits over just ad hoc queries that we execute and run, especially as opposed to coding some of our query functionality out in our actual application code. So let's talk about the benefits. Now, keep in mind, these may not necessarily extend over to other database platforms like Oracle, DB2, and those sorts of things. So be careful about butting heads with those guys about this stuff. But the first thing in the Microsoft SQL Server world, a stored procedure reduces network traffic. Now think about it. The only thing that we pass from our application code over to the database is the name of the stored procedure. Now we might pass a couple of parameters with it, but we don't pass all the code for the stored procedure. So all of that stuff sits very neatly on the database server. It's never sent over the network. And so all we've got to run across the network is the name of the stored procedure. Stored procedures give us stronger security. The code that's inside that stored procedure is what determines what happens to the database. So every time we call a stored procedure, the same code runs every time, and it always executes the same. And so I can write up a stored procedure. My DBA can look over the code and test it and say, yeah, this looks good to me. Then when this stored procedure is added to the database as an object, we now know exactly what's going to happen every time someone calls that stored procedure, and we can give users permissions to execute the stored procedure, or we can deny those permissions as well. But users are not required to have permissions on the underlying object. So say a stored procedure is manipulating a table, the user doesn't have to have permissions to work with that table as long as they have permissions to execute the stored procedure that does. So it also simplifies security, makes it stronger that way as well. Reuse of code is a big one with stored procedures, because if I'm writing the code with functionalities in stored procedures, then that means all that code stays in one place. And this eliminates multiple rewrites of the same code in 45 different places all over an application. It decreases code inconsistency since all the code's in one place, and once we get it right, it's all right. It allows the code to be accessed and executed by any user or application who possesses the necessary permissions. It always runs the same. It always runs in the same order, and the user can't mess it up. They can either call it or fail to call it, and that's about the limit of what they can do. Easier maintenance. When a client app calls a stored procedure, as opposed to having a bunch of database code out there in the C# or VB code or whatever else is being used to manipulate the data that's being collected through the desktop application or internet application that's actually connecting to and making changes to our database, when the client app just calls stored procedures, instead of including T-SQL code out there, only the stored procedures need to be updated even when there's underlying database changes. So say there's a reorganization and we change some table names, add some new tables, whatever. All we have to do is go update our stored procedures, and all the client application code works just fine. Improved performance is another big one for stored procedures. A stored procedure is compiled the first time it's executed. Now, really, most all queries are somewhat pseudo-compiled, and there's a query execution plan created, and it's stored. The problem is a lot of ad hoc queries, by the time they get run again, the plan has fallen out. It's not exact. It's not the same. There's all kinds of reasons the execution plan is not chosen. But on stored procedures, it is compiled, and the execution plan can be stored as reused on subsequent executions of a stored procedure because it's an identical execution every time. Now, keep in mind, the query processor doesn't have to create a new plan for every execution, and so the stored procedure is just much, much faster and much less of a burden on resources on the SQL Server. So there's a lot of reasons to use stored procedures. It's actually kind of difficult to find reasons not to use stored procedures, but there are some of those out there. But for now, just understand there's many benefits to using stored procedures.